photographer Baron Woolman, back when it was a pamphlet, unfortunately fell and broke his arm 2 days ago. So he was restricted from travel, and he won't be with us today, but I know he's watching. We love you, Baron. Get well quick. And your spirit of rock and roll has been brought to the stage. Concert photography is exciting. But concert photography isn't everything you think it is if you have never been to or shot a concert or worked in the environment before. And it's a very tricky, difficult environment to work in, and you're always living under somebody else's rules that could potentially change on a dime, which will frustrate you, but you have to learn how to deal with that situation. Very thick-skinned. And so what we want to do is put together a panel discussion. We tried to produce something that would give you the insight on what it's like to shoot rock and roll, but not just current day, when, maybe decades ago, when it was a little easier to possibly shoot or photograph a band or get access the way you wanted to, and how that's changed through the years. And I think that's a really great topic. So we're going to get this going by introducing the panel, and a gentleman that's been a dear friend of mine for many years. He is a legend in rock photography, and you will recognize his work as we see some of it today. He's a local from Las Vegas, but he's also part of New Zealand's community. Let me introduce to the stage Robert Knight.
Yep. Yep.
Welcome, Robert.
Yep.
This next lady is somebody, Robert, you can take that seat there. This next lady is somebody I just met recently. Somebody that was recommended to me, and when I went online to see her work, the work of Jenn Deveraux is so clean and so pristine in the way of rock and roll. I just love the way she shoots and her style. And let me introduce to the stage Jenn Deveraux. Don't trip. She said her biggest fear was tripping with these large shoes. Now, this next cat is one of my favorite people on the planet. Not only is he so well groomed and he's so handsome, but when you look at the work of rock photographers today, it's sometimes very hard to distinguish one photographer from the next, but he certainly has a very cool, clean style. He's got great relationships with a lot of bands. I know he tours with Jason Aldean and many bands, and he's partnered with his brother, Chris, who is not here today. And I am part of the Owyoung team. Let me introduce Nikon ambassador Todd Owyoung. Yes, at the Photo Plus Expo show, Todd and Chris have made me a Owyoung, a part of the Bro team.
Yes.
So, I want to get started here. If you have not Googled Robert Knight or some the other panelists, Robert, why don't you start and take us through a little journey on what got you started in photography? How did you move on? I know you started off as a musician, and and where your background is. What got you inspired to become a photographer?
I grew up in Hawaii, and my parents were in the religious business. My dad was a minister, and I wasn't allowed to listen to rock music. I wasn't allowed to go to movies. I wasn't allowed to go to concerts. But when I was 15, I snuck out and I saw the Rolling Stones play in Hawaii. And I wasn't a photographer then, but I saw this energy, and I saw the light bulbs back then going off, and the girls were screaming, and I said, whatever this is, I have to be part of this. So I figured out a way at a very young age to get to London, and at 16 I went to London and spent 3 months there, right in the middle of swinging London in 1966. They were making the movie Blow Up, and that photographer in the movie Blow Up was the inspiration for me. Because I was left-handed, I couldn't really be a musician. So I thought, I can be a photographer, and I want to be like that guy in Blow Up and have a Nikon camera, and I want to work with that band, the Yardbirds. And within 2 years, I was working with that band, the Yardbirds, and I had a Nikon camera. So I was at the very first show that Led Zeppelin did in the United States. I think I was the only photographer there. And many times, back when I started, I was the only photographer in a venue. You'd go see Jimi Hendrix or some of these bands, and I would be the only one there, and they welcomed me because I had a camera, and they were like, please, help yourself,
That's an important point, too, because, back then, and we're not talking, old or a long time ago, it's just the way the business, started for you is there are so many layers of management now, it's just different than it was before, and we're going to delve into that a lot more. Jenn, what inspired you to pick up a camera, and how did you end up in the world of music?
Well, I always had cameras. I was always playing with film cameras growing up. And then when I was a teenager, I got into sneaking MTV because I wasn't allowed to watch MTV growing up. So I would sneak MTV and I'd watch these music videos, and then I'd go to the local bookstore and just like look at the magazines, and I just loved seeing the pictures in those magazines. And I was like, one day I want to do that. Well, I started sneaking in cameras to concerts, and I went to one concert. It was my favorite band, Deveraux Assault, and I was sitting there taking pictures with my little film camera, and the singer Louise Post was like, "What are you doing down there? Come up here." And it was in this pit, and it was the first time I was in a photo pit, which I thought was amazing. And I didn't think that at that time that would be something that I could do, myself. So several years later, I went to a festival called Voodoo Fest in New Orleans, and I'd snuck in my camera. And the way I snuck in my cameras was, back then they allowed disposable cameras, but they would not allow digital cameras. So I would go to the store and buy a disposable camera, take it out of the box, put my digital point and shoot in there, and then glue it shut. And then I would bring it in, and I didn't have any problems with that. So I would fight my way to the front, all the way to the very front of the barricade. And then right before the band went on, I'd see this slew of photographers coming in front of the barricade. And I was like, I want to do that. I don't want to have to fight my way. And the whole time I'm at a concert, all I cared about was getting the perfect shot with my little point-and-shoot camera. So I ended up getting a second job to pay for a digital SLR. It was a Nikon D40X. And then I reached out to a local newspaper, and I said, look, if I give you these images for your publication, would you get me a credential, a press pass? And they were like, sure. So then I was credentialed for my first press pass, and I took on a few more concerts that way. And the local radio station, I reached out to them and I said, do you mind if I shoot for you for your website? And they were like, sure. So then I had built a portfolio at this point, and I was in that Voodoo Fest photo pit a year later from the date that I decided I wanted to do it.
Right, and that's so important too, because I have a lot of people that come to me, and I've been photographing rock and roll for about 15 years now, and it is a process. You have to, we'll talk about relationships and how important they are, but everybody has the opportunity, and Rob, we talk about this all the time, that if you want to jump into this and start learning how to shoot concerts or performance arts, is you start local. You start small. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Todd, talk about your experiences and how you and your brother worked together, and when did you pick up the camera, and fast forward to, why rock and roll?
Well, I was always that artsy kid. I always drew as a kid, and I was going to art school, and I figured someone in art school should have a camera. So I saved up money, bought a Nikon FM3A, manual film camera, and was shooting on that, shooting black and white film, developing myself. And as a graduation present, I bought myself a Nikon D70.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. And I shot on that for a couple of years. And how I got involved with music photography was that my best friend invited me to a show 13 years ago now. And I had no idea who the bands were. And I figured, as a way of entertaining myself, I could bring my camera and shoot photos of the artists. And I'd have fun that way, even if I didn't like the music. But as it turned out, the bands were amazing, and something for me just clicked. Capturing musicians on stage, working with the lighting, the short time in which to do it all, it hooked me. And I knew that's what I wanted to do. Right.
To me, I do have a little bit of a story. I was just trying to be cool because I was not cool, and I thought photographing bands would be cool. Quite a while ago, Nikon sponsored a local theater on Long Island, the Jones Beach Theater. And while we were in there, I was actually asked, I'd never shot a concert before. I always kind of dreamed of it because being at shows like up in the upper levels, you look down and, like you said, Jen, you see people on the other side of the barrier, and it's got to be so cool to be so close to them, and it's like a different dynamic in seeing. But I was asked to assist on a press outing when the band Aerosmith had come to the beach. And I said, I don't know anything about rock and roll, but you shoot sports photography. I said, well, I do, and I guess there's sort of a similar approach that I would take to rock and roll. And I jumped in, and Motley Crue and Aerosmith were playing the same venue, the same night. And as soon as I started photographing Motley Crue and the music was kicking, I don't know about you guys, there was an adrenaline rush that kicked in. And any of you here in the audience photograph concerts? I mean, do you feel that like adrenaline rush when the music starts, and you feel like you're in another world until you are then booted out after the second or third song. And I became addicted to that and that whole process. And I can tell you from that day to now, there's not a day that you don't learn something about being in a venue. Robert, go back a little bit, and you talk about you had the camera, and they just assumed that you were with the band, right?
Yeah.
And your access was open. Talk about the freedoms that you had.
Basically, I convinced my parents I needed to go to the San Francisco Art Institute in 1968, primarily because I saw Bill Graham was bringing all of those bands that I wanted to see to the Fillmore. And so I enrolled at the San Francisco Art Institute, and Annie Leibovitz was my classmate, believe it or not.
Everybody know Annie Leibovitz?
Yeah. So, but basically, there weren't like necessarily backstage passes or publicists or people. You would just show up at a gig, and you'd have a camera. Nobody would stop you. So the first time I shot Jimi Hendrix at the Winterland Ballroom in 1968, I just kept walking and people kept getting out of my way. And I just ended up at the bottom of the stage. And I brought one roll of film, 36 exposure roll of Tri-X.
Jen, do you know what that is?
Oh, yeah.
And so there I am. I'm in front of Jimi Hendrix, and I was so mesmerized by this man and what he did. But the trick for me was I was only photographing bands whose music I liked, so I could anticipate what they were going to do, or I knew the different moods of the swings of the song. So anyway, I ended up shooting my 14 pictures. That's all I did on that first roll of film. And then I just watched the show at the foot of the stage with my mouth open. And then the irony was, almost 48 years later, every single photo I took that night was used for the cover and the inside of the DVD of Jimi Hendrix Live at the Winterland, because somebody had filmed it. So,
wow.
But the bands were very much happy to see you. They were seeking publicity. They wanted people to photograph them. And I would say at the time, there was just a handful in the United States of professional music photographers.
Right.
Probably less than a dozen.
You know, and obviously the business has changed so drastically since then, because Jen, have you ever had that open carte blanche to do whatever you want with every band that you want?
Absolutely not.
No. A lot of rules, right? Talk about some of the rules and restrictions that we live under.
It's generally the first 3 songs. It can be different for certain bands, but that's kind of the average. And it varies from artist and venue, but after the first 3, you're usually escorted out. You can't have your gear in the venue a lot of the time, so you're escorted to walk to your car, and if you live in New Orleans, that could be far away from the venue. There's also, sometimes there's releases you have to sign, and you can choose whether or not you want to sign those. There's a lot, no flash, that's absolutely a no. You can't have flash. Yeah,
it's essentially like you are escorted in like a child, you're escorted out like a child. If you shoot one note beyond, it's not just the security within the venue, because the security within the venue will actually be taken over by the security of the band. So then there's going to be this big, bruising, 6'7" gorilla that's going to come out, and they're going to grab you by the shirt because they don't care, because it's their job to clear that area. And I didn't mean to grab you, Todd. Was that too hard? But it is a tough situation. But I know, Todd, one of the things I want to talk about and delve into is relationships and how when you do end up connecting with the right people, 2 things, relationships and trust. So talk about the relationships you developed and the trust that you have created with these bands to create more open access for yourself.
Yeah, trust and relationships, that's the key to certainly music photography, just like any type of photography. And I think it's something where you have to prove yourself, because you're often in a privileged space, whether it's backstage or in the photo pit, and you have access to people who are public figures who don't necessarily want cameras in their faces. And so I think there's a level of proving yourself that you can basically hang, that you are respectful, that what you shoot will go to the client, whether it's the management company, the production company, the artists themselves, and that you're giving them that first look, and then they're not going to go anywhere else, because the moment you violate that trust, that you're posting it on Instagram before they have approvals, et cetera, that you're gone, and they're not going to invite you back.
Yep. And that's important to get invited back. I had a situation with a band, Shinedown, and we were backstage before they were going out, and I noticed the lead singer, I had a 24-1.4, fast glass, and there was only a firelight up above, and the high ISO of a D4S at the time was so perfect for that environment. And I snapped the picture as he was kissing a woman. And the one big mistake that you can make right away is, oh, wow, what a great picture. I'm going to post it to the internet. But I actually emailed the drummer the picture. And I said, who's in the photo? Now, why would I ask that question? Because you don't know who that is. It could be somebody on the road. Maybe it's not somebody that the lead singer wants to be seen with. And it happened to be his wife. And his wife took care of the band's merchandise on the road. But you talk about the trust and carte blanche. At that moment, everything I wanted with Shinedown was open access to me because I asked before I posted the picture and the trust was there.
Yeah.
And I just think that's, in any business, I think that's really cool and important. But you know, I want to go deeper, Robert. Robert, I can't say enough about the people you know and the people you've introduced me to, but the relationships you have along the way, how do you maintain those relationships? And I know you have a great relationship with Slash and the guys from Aerosmith and all the bands that I grew up loving. How do you deal with relationships?
I think, again, going to what you were talking about is that they always trusted that you wouldn't exploit your access. Because a lot of times you do get pictures that you shouldn't, or you see things you shouldn't, or you may not be what they like.
Right.
You become very sensitive to certain artists where they like to be photographed from. But the main thing is that you haven't abused that position. And I pretty much, for the most part, still maintain relationships with a lot of the people I shot in the very early days. I mean, if I still see Robert Plant or Elton John, and my wife Marianne Billum and she's my photographer partner as well.
Marianne's in the audience.
She's over there.
Hey, Marianne.
Yeah. But we were the only two people allowed to photograph Jeff Beck's wedding, and Paul McCartney and Jimmy Page was there with no security, and they were like encouraging us.
Right.
And so it's a level of trust, and I think that is the key, because you know it's a business where you know you got to look after their interests too.
Well, and I think that's so important. I've always said in lecturing about music photography is it's our responsibility to make the artist look good.
Yep.
If you ever want to be not invited back, send a picture up that makes an artist look silly by being in the middle of a note, or they're trying to get to a high note and their face is distorted, or it's just a bad moment overall. Always look for the best moments where they look the best, and I guarantee you will develop a relationship where they'll ask you back. Jenn, who have you been close to, and what bands have you been working with?
I actually don't get very close to the bands. I'm more close with the publicists. I think it's really important to build the relationships with them.
Absolutely.
Especially when you're shooting for a publication and not on tour. It's important to note that you're not always going to get approved, and to be courteous just the same. There have been a lot of photographers who have been blacklisted for being very rude for not being approved, and I think it's very important to keep a good relationship with the publicist, because they also are the door into getting a press pass.
You know, that's a great point. Attitude is everything. And I see too many times through venues arrogant photographers that come in that believe that just because they're inside that barrier, they have been granted an access to do something that nobody else does. And I became the house photographer for Live Nation at Jones Beach, and I share that responsibility with a woman named Christine. Christine is beautiful. She does great work and has helped me out quite a bit. But the one thing I do care about all the time is the paying customer. You're not there to stand in front of somebody, but that attitude of the photographer sometimes means everything, because one photographer with a bad attitude can have an entire lot of 15 photographers photographing the band swept out in 2 seconds, right? And so, you know, Todd, talk about some of the experiences that you may have had with other photographers, and has it hurt you at all? Have you ever been in a situation where you've had to tell us, hey, tone it down, man, or we're all going to get thrown out of here?
I think photo pit etiquette is a big thing. Nowadays, when there are so many press photographers in a pit, where, especially at music festivals, there might be dozens and dozens of photographers sharing one
I hate
space.
festivals. I really hate festivals.
So you might be 5 or 6 photographers deep in a situation like that, and being respectful of your space, not doing Hail Marys over the head if you're the first photographer in that row is really a big thing, and just being mindful of your own space. But yeah, to your point, if someone is using flash, for example, or being disruptive or rowdy in a photo pit, that pit will be cleared, simply because it's a security issue.
Right.
And it's also, you know, there are contract issues, and the artist security is not going to tolerate any, you know, misstep.
That's true. And when they do come out, when the publicist or the stage manager comes out and requests that you don't do something, you don't do it. I think every one of us has photographed Dave Grohl. And that was my bucket list band, the Foo Fighters, this summer. They came through Jones Beach. And the first thing they said was, please don't chase Dave. And you're disheartened because you feel like now, of course, Foo Fighters, there's 20 photographers in a pit that fits 10. And I'm like, oh man, this is going to stink because I'm not going to have a great angle. But they say that because Dave is smart enough, right? You know Dave, right, Robert?
Yep.
And he's so conscious of photographers, he makes sure everybody gets the picture.
That's right.
And there's not a bad moment with Dave, which is, it could be a bad thing because a lot of the pictures we all shoot look exactly the same.
Yeah.
So I think the challenge then would be to try and create an angle or some kind of shot or a moment, steal that moment that nobody else has stolen. And, you know, for me, it's like when he's lifting the guitar up or when he turns with sweat, get him against a dark background so the sweat flies. And I think that's really cool. Robert, let's dig in just a little bit more. I want to talk about a story some may not know about. I know you did a film called Rock Prophecies.
Yeah.
And the basis of that film was based on Stevie Ray Vaughan, or part of that film was based on Stevie Ray. Can you tell that story?
It was a very sad story. Stevie Ray became a really good friend of mine. I did a tour in 1989 with Jeff Beck and Stevie Ray, and we spent about a week and a half at Princess Paisley Park in rehearsals in Minneapolis. And we really kind of bonded, and over the course of that tour, we became really close. And then a year later, he called me, and he was going to do a couple of shows in Wisconsin with Eric Clapton, and they were going to do an ad for Fender. All of Eric, Stevie Ray, Jimmy Vaughan, all lined up with Robert Cray, and this was a very important thing for him because it was going to put him in the pantheon of being with Clapton and Beck and Page.
Right.
And so he asked me to be the photographer, and the first day was a 2-day event, 50,000 people. Eric forgot we were doing a photo shoot. So basically he said, listen, Robert, I'll let all the press photographers shoot today. Just hang out with Stevie. Tomorrow you can have the whole show to yourself. So I sat there and talked with Stevie for the entire day, and then the next day came, we did the big photo shoot, and then I photographed Stevie. I mean, it was the most amazing thing. I was the only guy in the pit, on stage, backstage. I walked him to a helicopter, and he basically said to me, if anything ever happens to me, you'll know me when you hear me. And the helicopter crashed and killed him. And I didn't know it had done that. And the next morning, I woke up to the news that Eric Clapton had died, is what I heard on the news. And so I called Stevie's hotel in Chicago, only to find out that it was Stevie. And this so upset me, but those things were haunting in my head about if you know me, if you hear me. And somehow I managed to meet, through a friend of mine, the producer of Will and Grace and Seinfeld, and he wanted to do a reality show of my wife and I, and we said absolutely not, but eventually he came to the idea of doing a documentary, and the documentary was called Rock Prophecies, and in there we have all the usual people that I work with, Jeff Beck and Slash and Def Leppard, but then the idea was to bring in some bands that no one ever heard of. And I helped a young kid out of Texas who was 16 named Tyler Bryant, and he was championed through the movie. And once the movie came out, I was inundated by young musicians around the world asking me to help them. Mm-hmm. So it opened up a whole new way of my being relevant with young and happening bands, but at the same time, I'm able to work with the next generation of Jimi Hendrixes and Jeff Becks and Eric Claptons and Dave Grohls. So I have a program now with 140 kids around the planet that are the next generation of guitar heroes that I work and help and network with publicists, put them in big bands.
Right.
I have 2 in Shania Twain's band. I mean, it's part of what I do as a photographer in giving back now, and it keeps me relevant.
And that's called the Brotherhood of the Guitar?
The Brotherhood of the Guitar. You can see it online.
Wow,
yeah.
Very, very, very cool.
Yeah.
So Jenn, talk about, let's shift to gear. When you go to a concert, how do you prep? What are you bringing?
I keep 2 cameras on me at all times so I don't have to change lenses. I have my D810 with my 7200 and then my D700 with my 50mm lens. And if I'm in a small venue, I will bring my 1424. And those are my favorites, really.
Very interesting, because most people would say that second lens was a 24-70, right?
Yeah, I went with the 1424 because I was shooting a lot at the House of Blues in New Orleans, and if you've ever been there, the barricade is this small, and you're right on the stage, so 1424 was the better option for me.
Todd, what are your lens choices when you're out there?
Oh, too many. My go-to 3 are the 14-24, 24-70, and 70-200, all f2.8.
The Holy Trinity.
The Holy Trinity.
Right.
And lately, I've been using the 300mm f4 PF lens, as well as the 8 to 15mm fisheye from Nikon.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really difficult, we talked about this before we came up, is how do you distinguish yourself from another photographer? What style can you create? How do you not look like all of our Dave Grohl pictures look the same? And I think that has a lot to do with optics. And one of the lenses I picked up and started shooting religiously now, because it's a little harder in a pit to handhold a 200 f2, which I think is probably the best concert lens ever, is the 105-1.4. And it just creates such a unique look as opposed to the zoom that I thought, that's a great lens to work with. So, Jim, when you said the 50 or a fixed lens, which is not the common answer, because when you have 3 songs, you're waiting hours to get in, right? What does that equate to? Maybe 15 minutes of shooting. And when the band really doesn't like photographers, the first song will be about 30 seconds, if you're lucky. Or if you're photographing Janet Jackson, I remember the stipulation was you get the first 30 seconds of her first song.
Oh.
Well, I can shoot 300 pictures in that 30 seconds, but they're all going to look the same. So, that gets kind of crazy. Robert, what gear do you like to carry out there?
Well, at this point in my life, I've become very sensitive to weight because of all the years of carrying the heavy cameras and bags. So I try to really be economic. So I'm using a 24-70, 7200, and maybe a 300 or 400 mil that I'll keep to the side of the stage. I don't even bring it in. Because what happens with me is, and my wife, we'll team up together, we'll work with Aerosmith or we work with Def Leppard or Journey, is that you've got to spread out a 2.5-hour show, so you sort of start with layers of the type of photography, but toward the end of the show, I'll then go outside of the pit or the stage and shoot with a longer lens, hoping to try to come up with something different or unusual, because when you're shooting multiple nights of the same band, you could get into the trap of repeating yourself very easily.
Correct.
And so, and I force myself to work with those few lenses and then force myself to come in, really close and to work there. So.
And that's really critical. And you had mentioned it before,
Yeah.
that you study the band, right?
Yeah.
I think when I got very serious about rock and roll, and you guys chime in, that I started not only looking for the set list of the tour, because again, if you only have those 3 songs and you're not working with the band, you want to know what's going to happen. Where are the beats? Where are the high notes? Because when you know the drums start to wail and that the lead singer goes for the high note, there's your impact moment. And I think the separation of the difference between an average rock photo or a concert photo and a really great one is just like sports, it's peak performance. It's that peak note. It's that moment when the mouth is open, or the sweat is flying, or the hand's in the right position, not halfway. So, that anticipation and study. Jen, how much studying do you do before a show?
A lot. I actually, I have a lot of friends who are photographers that are in other states, so I can reach out to them if they've shot the artist prior. They'll give me tips on what the artist does in the first 3 songs, if it's going to be soundboard, if it's going to be pit, because, if it's going to be soundboard, you want to be prepared for that as well. And I'll watch videos. If it's the first, show of the tour, it's kind of hard to do a little research. I mean, you could do your research of how the band interacts for past tours and such, but yeah, I'll just look at videos and get on Instagram, look at crowd pictures too, because that tells a lot.
So, when we say things, we just throw this out there like soundboard. What soundboard means at Jones Beach Theater is a 500 or 600 millimeter lens if you want a shot that's worth anything, unless you're shooting the entire stage. So soundboard is in the front of house, and one of the most difficult things for me early on was the opposite meaning of the things that they were saying. So when someone said, "Oh, you're front of house," I was like, "Oh, big shot, I'm going right up to the front," which actually means the back of the arena by the soundboard. And where Robert is sitting right now is stage left. And these things are important to know. I'm on stage right, but from your position, it looks like Robert's on stage right. But when you do get into the environment, it's really important to know your way around.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that I thought was very, very cool, and it was before I actually met Todd. I met his brother Chris first. You work for iHeartRadio as well, right? And you work with bands. You get gigs where you're actually touring and working for the band. You're shooting for the band. And it's so funny because when you're shooting these days, a lot of hip-hop artists will throw videographers, shooting video up on stage, and they're standing right behind the main subject. And I remember peering up at a Jason Aldean concert, and I see this kid down squatting, which you were very courteous to bend down out of everybody's way, and it turned out to be Todd. How do you gain that access? How did you get that gig?
So we started working with Jason Aldean in 2009. My brother and I shot a Wrangler jeans ad campaign. Because at the time, Jason was one of their sponsored artists. And my brother actually kept in touch with his manager. And when his tour photographer quit in 2013. This was right before Jason was playing Madison Square Garden, the biggest show of his career. And his manager, remember that Chris lives in New York, and he emailed him and he said, hey, are you free on Friday? And my brother's like, sure, yeah. And he shot that show. They loved the images. And then a few months later, Jason was playing at Sanford Stadium in Athens, Georgia. Then that was like, it was about 80,000 people. So that was the biggest show he'd ever played. And they had both of us down. We covered that. And we've basically done his tour photography ever since.
That's phenomenal. Now, do you do that on a regular basis? Are there other bands that you're looking into working with or digging into?
We started with Jason, and we now do a lot of tour photography for his management company, Maverick. So we cover Jason Aldean, Darius Rucker, Rasker Flats, Brooks and Dunn, Reba. Yeah.
I think one of the things I learned too, and sometimes it's a dirty word to the industry, is house photographer. People on the outside perceive that as you can do whatever you want, whenever you want, but you're still under the same restrictions of everybody else. But you also have to take the good with the bad, and if you're shooting a season somewhere, if it's a band you don't like, you still have to shoot it. Jen, how do you get yourself up for photographing a band when you just don't like the music or you don't like the artist?
Well, honestly, I'm very open to music. I love being introduced to new music. So I just like going to hear new music a lot of times. Now, there are certain genres of music that I don't really care for, but to me, it's just, I don't know, I just love shooting live music in general, so it doesn't really bother me too much to shoot music that I don't like. I just like it. I don't know. I like listening to music. I think it's really cool to be introduced. I make sure to make time for opening artists too, because it may be a band I've never heard of, but I want to check them out and see what they're all about. And I've gotten introduced to a lot of really cool bands that way.
And I don't think you can ever underestimate the opening acts, because the opening acts are the future, right? And Robert, we talk about this all the time. Everybody's so high-strung about getting out there to photograph, the Foo Fighters are a big band, but really the gold is in the newer up-and-coming artists, because again, this is the way the industry's become, and there's nothing we can do about it, and you have to be thick-skinned, and it's just a part of protecting yourself as a business. I'm sure there wasn't a lot of protection of business back in the early days, but a band like the Foo Fighters they're going to protect their image, they're going to protect the way people perceive them, they're going to be there for their fans first and foremost. So we always sit there and think about, well, I could be making great pictures, and you're letting people take pictures with cell phones, and they're really crappy, but they're doing that because they want to favor their fans.
Yeah.
I mean, Kiss, as you know, Robert, is one of the best bands that connects with their fans, better than anybody else. So it's really crazy at times, in the way we have to deal with this. But the business is what the business is, and I call it rock and roll time. Yeah. I don't ever expect an artist to get back to me right away, because this is not glamorous. If you've ever been on tour, has anybody been on tour with a band? The day after day, night after night, you're done at midnight, you get on a bus, you move to the next city, you wake up in the middle of the afternoon, you start prepping right away for that next day, and then at a certain point in time, you got your sound check, and that's pretty crazy. And so it's not as glamorous as you think, so you wonder why people get cranky on the road these days. It's because they're dying to get home.
I like to shoot the sound checks. Because sometimes at the sound check, the band is a lot looser. They'll let you wander around the stage or get out on the thrust. And some of the more cooler things we're getting nowadays have been from the sound checks.
Yeah, and talk about that a little bit, Robert, because you've had a lot of behind-the-scenes access. To me, we see these beautiful pictures from the stage, and the challenge is capturing the moment. But the gold really is in what? People want to see what's happening behind the stage.
Yeah, and I think those pictures are more valuable now, because everybody's got a million pictures of the same artist on tour. But if you have some intimate relationship off stage where they're doing something out of character, it's quite interesting. Like, I went surfing with Led Zeppelin, or I went to a Halloween party with Alice Cooper. And those are things that you were just like, you can't believe. You got to pinch yourself they're happening. But the access was more, played golf with Alice, you know what I mean? And those kind of pictures nobody's got that kind of stuff, and that's what I really like doing, was a lot of that as well.
So when you are dealing in this environment, Todd, okay, so you and your brother get this gig with Jason Aldean. Are you doing this for one show, or do they give you a series of shows that you can work in?
It'll be a series of shows. His management company is very strategic about the way they use photography, and so they don't need the day-to-day for the 40 dates that they're covering. They'll probably have us out for, half a dozen or maybe a dozen shows for a concert, for a tour season. And they're really looking for this one hero shot that they can use for the next season, for the ad mat, for the posters, et cetera, for merchandise, if that shot kind of happens to be made. But they're really very calculated as far as how they use the photography. Jason runs his own Instagram account, so they don't need that kind of social fodder.
I want to delve into this too, the social part of all this. I talk about this with every panel and the importance of the social media, not only for you, but for the band itself. Jenn, are you how into social media? What is your social media platform? We have your Instagram account up, and if you want to follow any of these great photographers, just look up there, and that will roll into their Instagram accounts. How often are you on social?
I think it's important to be pretty active on socials, and that's that's how bands, if you're shooting for a publication, if you want to post pictures, and if you're allowed through your publication, the bands see it, they can repost it, and then you're getting your name out there with them. They see you, they see what you're doing. So social media is really big right now, and I think it's important to be active on those. I think it's important.
Todd, you and your brother, you on social? Are you pushing social? How hard?
Every day. I think that it's extremely important on all sides, not only for the client-facing, putting images in front of clients, because I view social media as essentially a very loose and fluid portfolio. It's not as precious as a portfolio where it's the 30 best, these kind of like images you put on a pedestal, but it's something that you're constantly improving, constantly working on, and you're showing new work that's fresh. And maybe not every single photo that I post to Instagram is a portfolio shot, but it gives me that flexibility and that opportunity to keep people updated and to show new work without waiting for that sort of iconic photo that is going to make it to the portfolio.
Robert, talk about this transition. You mentioned before earlier, you photographed the first Led Zeppelin show here in the United States. I guess you weren't thinking about computers and social back then. This transition into what we're dealing with now in social, how have you made the transition yourself?
Well, I mean,
because you're still actively shooting, right?
Yeah, no, I'm very actively shooting. And so it was something I had to do, like digital photography. It was like either that or you're going to be a dinosaur. You're going to end up like not relevant. So the client's going to demand this and that. So the social is probably more key now to anything, to let people know and be aware of gallery shows you're going to do, or where you are, or just kind of keeping your name out there, because it's highly competitive right now. There's a lot of people fighting for the same dollar. So I think everybody's trying to constantly push that envelope. And let everybody know that you're still relevant and you're still working, and
I would love your perspective too, all of you. I feel like we have such amazing historical epic bands, the Rolling Stones, the Who, Led Zeppelin. Has the music industry changed so much that will we ever have another band like the Rolling Stones or Aerosmith, even though they're all still playing 20, 30 years from now, 40 years from now? Has the business changed so much that you're not going to have that kind of impact from a band?
Well, it's fractured the way the business is now. There's so many different genres, where before it was just rock and country and that. But I'm watching bands emerge all the time. I mean, don't forget the Foo Fighters sort of came out of nowhere.
Right.
We haven't really had a great new guitar hero since Eddie Van Halen, but they're emerging. But like Greta Van Fleet's getting a lot of attention right now, but there's another band called Bishop Gunn that's a lot more original and a lot more of a Leonard Skinner sound, or more country sound, that I think might have really a long thing. But the bands that seem to be making all the money and touring are all the classic bands from my era.
So we talk about the similarities in photos. I'm going to ask you each, to start with you, Jenn. How do you try to make yourself unique? How do you try to do something different?
I think, me personally, I like to try to find a way to have the image almost look like a portrait. Like when the artist looks like they're about to step near some smoke or a different part of the backdrop, that's when I try to shoot the image, because everyone is shooting the same angles a lot of times. Especially if you're at soundboard, you're going to be at that same angle. Everybody is. So you want to try to find something that's going to make it stand out. Maybe if you're in the pit, my favorite spot to be is not dead center, because there's a microphone stand there. I like to be side stage with my 7200.
Create more of a profile, right?
Right, and get a great shot that way. And it's good. It's very important to move around. Don't stay stagnant. Don't stay in one place. Move around, because you don't want all of the same images from the same location. It's boring. So
especially
make sure
within the
you're moving around.
15 minutes. One of the things I tried to do to counter the looking like everybody else was I actually brought a 500 f4 into the pit once, and it forced me to shoot in such a different way. And I may have like beard hairs from Dave Matthews, but when he opened his mouth and he sang, it was just such a different, unique picture. Todd, what do you try to do to change it up, change the game?
I think to what Jen was speaking about, I think position is one big thing. If there's a pack of photographers, there's 10 photographers who are in one area, go where they're not. That's as simple as that in terms of finding new angles and positions that will make, maybe it's going to play with the lighting a little differently, the angle is going to be different, the perspective, the lenses you use as a result of being in a different position will give you a different look. And in addition, simply access. I think if you're not shooting from, as an editorial photographer, if you have a little bit more access, that's going to be a huge advantage to making images that aren't simply what you see everywhere else. So shooting on stage, behind the scenes, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's very important. And Jen, you mentioned it before. You know, when you look at this, one thing I learned evolving into rock and roll is you don't stop thinking about photography. And I think it's very quick and easy to get caught up in the artist, caught up in the moment, caught up in the rush, and not stop to see the light, watch the light patterns, you know, watch when they are, like you said, moving in and out of the smoke, but when the light's hitting the side of the face or the front of the face, and a lot of times there's repetition in light, so it may even come back. But I often say, if you ever photograph a show with a great light show, nice, good, clean, colorful gel light, you find that lighting person, you kiss them on the lips deeply, because that does change the way the pictures will come out. You see it in some of the cleanliness and the way you shoot. And yet, bands like The Police have probably had some of the worst lighting ever, and most contrasty light, and you have to fight that on the fly. So, Robert, talk about the importance of light. I mean, I just said it was important, but
well, I
for
mean, you know, back in the day, the light shows were really dim, and so shooting in San Francisco at his early shows, I was using flash bulbs in order to get shots because it was so dark and the lighting was so horrendous. They were doing really low light, kind of psychedelic light stuff.
They don't have 12,800 ISO
Right,
like we do now,
you know?
right?
But I mean, part of what my style is the light. I like using shots like this where I'm using and integrating light flares. I love flaring light. I love that effect. I try to stay away from the HDR. I feel like too many photographers now are looking the same, and that's sort of their style, but it's really a software
I see
style.
a lot of that, yeah.
You know, and I try to do, like you said, you try to do a clean shot. I forced myself to try to, you know, I did a 400 millimeter on the last Journey show as much as I could to force myself to get different things instead of sitting there at the bottom of the stage, you know? And I think you've got to constantly go for, a good shot is a good shot. You know, if you take the name of the artist out of it and it's just your brother or your sister and you show it to people, then you know whether or not you had a good shot. People say, well, that's a great shot. But I think that applies in music because like you said, because it's a good shot, or is it because it's Mick Jagger or Dave Grohl, you know?
Exactly, because I've seen too many pictures that are out of focus, not composed right, but people get fascinated by the fact that it happened to be Janis Joplin, right?
Yeah.
And it still makes it an epic picture, but it breaks all the rules of composition, all the rules of focus, all the rules of what a great photograph should be. And I kind of also throw that out there. It's not really a dig, but if ever your, you know, what do you call that, your watermark is fancier than the actual picture you take, then there's something wrong, and it's time to go back to the drawing boards about you know, the execution of photography. And I think I had learned a lesson a long time ago, and he's in the room here, and I will mention him. His name is Lindsay Silverman. The very first show I shot, I was so excited by. And Lindsay had photographed concerts for a long time. And I asked him to come look at my pictures. And he wasn't really thrilled, and I could pick that off. And all of a sudden, this big excitement of photographing Motley Crue was deflated down to, what did I do wrong? But he is right. The same lens, same angle, from the same pit, like you mentioned before. And that's what forced me to try to do things different.
Yeah.
Now, this has been a great discussion, and I wish we could talk a lot longer. And one of the things we wanted to do was start off with a nice panel and then follow it up with a program, and Todd is going to pick it up in about a minute when we get off the stage. So first, let me thank you guys, Robert and Jen, you know, for the insight. Again, this is a conversation, Robert, we talk for hours, right, on end. And it's a fascinating thing to do. You said it before. You want to get into rock and roll? Start local. Start with friends. Start with family. Use a flash at a venue where you're allowed, because when you graduate, a lot of times you're not allowed to. And it can be a really fun, fulfilling thing, but I would suggest highly that you bring your thick skin, because in 1 minute you may be able to do something, and in another moment you may be pulled out and you're not allowed. So you have to understand that too. But what we'd like to do is clear the stage now. Please stick around. Todd, again, to me, is one of the most hip, current, talented rock photographers that are out there. He's going to talk to you much deeper about what he does and how he does it. Jenn, again, thank you for your time. Robert, you are my hero and mentor, and you have been for many, many years. Thank you for that.
Cheers.
So we're going to clear the stage right now, and we're going to roll right into Todd Owyoung. So we're going to come up with a quick intro to Todd. Thank you, guys.